Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 1305. In lieu of our usual weekly lecture video, I'm going to take a little time to talk about our signature assignment. So the scope of what this brief video is going to do, and I do intend to keep it brief, I'd like to keep it under 20 minutes if it's possible, but what I'm trying to do is, one, explain what the signature assignment is all about. What are you trying to do? What are you really being asked to do in this assignment? Two, look at how you could potentially structure this assignment, because as an introductory level class, you may not have a lot of experience in how to properly structure one of these types of papers. And then the third and final area that we're going to be talking about in this video is some of my expectations for, and actually I shouldn't say expectations, I'm going to look at a number of pitfalls and give you a number of tips. I've been doing assignments like this. I've been in higher ed for over a decade now. I've read a lot of assignments like this. I've dealt with a lot of undergraduate papers, and I tend to, whatever I see year in, year out, it's rarely new. I don't see new mistakes very often. I see the same problems occurring again and again and again. And so what I'd like to do is point out some of those pitfalls so that you can avoid them when you're writing your paper. I'm going to be pointing out the things that I say routinely are going to lose you points. And so definitely, pay attention, take heed. This is all stuff that I put in the written document as well. And so there's no reason for you to come to me after the signature assignment is graded and say, I didn't know you didn't want me to use basically 3 pages of quotes and 2 paragraphs of original writing. I'm going to tell you right now I don't want that, and I'm going to explain why I don't want that and why I tend to see that the most. But just to get into the actual topic of the assignment, what is it that you're being asked to do here? A lot of students tend to look at the signature assignment and think that this is an opinion or a reflection piece on the institution of slavery in the United States. Nothing could be further from the truth. That is not what I'm asking you for. I don't want any modern opinions, and to put it really, really bluntly and not to put too fine a point on it, I don't want your personal opinions on slavery. My assumption is I have 150 people who are going to be turning this into me. My assumption is that all 150 think slavery is wrong, and I do think the same thing, just to make that very clear. However, this is not an opinion paper, and I don't want your personal opinions on slavery. You're being asked to analyze the opinions of people in the middle of the 19th century. What did they think about slavery? And really, the topic of this assignment is a primary source document analysis. We've provided you with primary sources on Blackboard. Some are pro-slavery, some are anti-slavery. For this paper, you are required to pick 2 of each for a total of 4 primary source documents. So when you go into those folders on Blackboard under the Signature Assignment tab, before you even start writing the paper, you need to select 4 documents. 2 need to be from the pro-slavery folder, 2 need to be from the anti-slavery folder. And so, what you're being asked to do is to look at how these authors are constructing their arguments. That is what you are analyzing as the author of this paper. You are not analyzing the institution of slavery in the United States. You are not passing value judgments on the writer. You are going to look through what they wrote, and you're going to explain how they use one or all 4 of our course analytical concepts. So we have these 4 concepts of democracy, capitalism, difference, and mobility. And I promise you, these documents have been handpicked. You won't look at any of these documents that don't contain at least one of those analytical concepts. What we're asking you to do is say, how are pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates in the middle of the 19th century using one of these 4 concepts to justify their point? Now, let me give you a quick example of this. A pro-slavery Southerner who wants to see this institution continue to exist in their society is going to say something to the effect of, if you take away slavery from the American South, you are ripping away our ability to make money. You are undercutting our economy. Therefore, they are going to say you can't get rid of slavery. It's too entrenched in the Southern economy. They are using capitalism as a concept to justify why there should be legal slavery in the United States. In the same vein, you're going to be looking at, for example, Abraham Lincoln's response to the mudsill theory. And he is basically saying that you do not have a free market capitalist economy if all of the labor in that labor market is not itself free to choose where they work, to go where they want to go, to find better paying opportunities when they arise. And so what he's saying is he's going to take capitalism and say the same thing. He's saying if you really believe in capitalism, then you can't have slave labor. Capitalism depends on free labor. And so this is the same way you can take these two authors, one anti-slavery, one pro-slavery, and they're both going to use capitalism as a way that they justify their points. And so when you look at those four concepts, it's important to understand what it is they're relating to in the first place. Capitalism has to do with money, has to do with a free market economy. It has to do with the government not regulating what happens in the private sector of economics in the United States. That's what capitalism is all about. And so people are going to be utilizing that idea to justify why there should or should not be slavery in the middle of the 19th century. You also have this concept of mobility. Now, that could mean physical movement. The ability to move from one state to another, or one city to another. Mobility, though, is a bigger, stickier kind of concept. It also applies to social mobility, the ability to start in a low class and then work your way up into the middle class or the upper class. And so that's another form of mobility. There's economic mobility, the freedom to choose where you work. I think you can see how that ties into this idea of slavery. Obviously, slaves don't get to pick and choose where they work. They're bought and sold and end up wherever they're told to go. And so this is another concept that plays heavily into this argument over slavery in the 19th century. And then we also have democracy, which is the rule of the people having a say in how their government is run. Democracy is the system by which we pick our elected representatives. But it also kind of can be torn out and utilized in a different way. When you look at democracy, you also have this innate understanding of who does and does not get to participate within that democratic process. Democracy is reserved for the citizens of a state. It doesn't belong to stateless actors, which slaves fall under that category of stateless actors. They are not citizens in the United States of America. And so that's how that concept is being used, is how people choose their leadership, how they choose their form of government, and they choose their rules of law. And so you might look at this and say, well, democracy is not being followed because of slavery. But slave owners would say, democracy is us here in Georgia choosing whether or not we have slavery and not having some guy in Washington, D.C. come down and tell us whether it's legal or illegal. So believe it or not, both slave owners and pro-slavery advocates and abolitionists are both going to use this idea of democracy to sort of make their point. And then difference is really probably the most apparent analytical concept that we have. Difference is referring to any kind of exactly what you might think, difference. And we're going to see it come out in a couple of different ways in these documents. The most prevalent and easy to see is racial difference. Obviously, there's not a lot of white slaves running around in the middle of the 19th century in the United States. So you have this issue of racial difference. That's usually going to be called upon by the anti-slavery advocates, the abolitionists. The pro-slavery advocates use difference as well. And they're going to play upon racial difference. And they're going to say, the reason that African Americans can't be citizens and people who make decisions in our society is because they are racially different. They're also going to look at regional differences. So what's happening in the North in the middle of the 19th century is way different from the South. Their economic systems are different. Their cultural beliefs are different. And so all the writers are going to call upon these different types of differences, to be redundant there, in order to make their point. So, to reiterate, your goal in this paper is not to argue for or against slavery. It's not to talk about the institution of slavery broadly or indistinctly. It is to talk about these primary source documents that have been provided to you on Blackboard. It's to compare and contrast which analytical concepts are being used by pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates. And it might surprise you, but a lot of the times the pro and anti-slavery advocates they'll look at the same scenario and use the same justification why there should or should not be slavery. And so that is what you're being asked to do. You are not talking broadly about slavery. You are talking specifically about the documents that are addressing slavery in the middle of the 19th century. Any attempt to impose a modern viewpoint on this is ahistorical and outside of the framework of a history class at a university level. So again, to reiterate, if you're wasting a lot of time in your paper talking about how bad the institution of slavery is, you're not going to get a good grade. That's something that's reserved for lower levels of education. We are beyond good and bad. Historians do not make value judgments. These people don't share our belief systems. It's almost as if it's the same thing as if you were to walk into another culture today and go, well, I don't know why they don't act like us and don't think like us. Because they're not you. They come from a different culture. And these people come from a different time period. And in their time period, they thought differently and felt differently than we did about these institutions. So, there are a few things I want to point out to you, basic concepts that you need to be familiar with when you address and attack this paper. You first need to know the difference between a primary source and a secondary source because you're going to be using both for different purposes in this paper. A primary source is a source that's created by a direct observer during the time period being investigated. That is a source that is made during the time period the paper is about, the class is talking about. So in other words, a slave owner writing about slavery while slavery is legal is a primary source. Me, as a historian writing about slavery 150 years later, is not a primary source. That is a secondary source. This is a source created by an observer with indirect knowledge after the event being investigated has occurred. The primary sources are used in this paper for evidence. The primary sources are the bulk of your paper. 80% of your paper should be dedicated to analyzing those primary sources. The secondary sources are there for context. So, the documents provided for you in those folders on Blackboard are your primary sources. The Corbett et al. U.S. History textbook and my lectures are your secondary sources. There's some other key information in there. One thing I do want to point out is that there's a really big misconception about how citation and that works. I do want to point out in a few different areas here. First, you need in-text references, parentheses after the statement that needs citation, giving us a shorthand note and pointing us to the source that you're getting that information from. That's an in-text reference. You need both in-text references in the body of the paper and a bibliography page at the end. One does not work without the other. An in-text reference basically says, I got it off of this page in this particular source. And then I go down to the bibliography page and that you're telling me, here's where you find the source if I need to go track it down in a library. Or here's where you find the source. This is our textbook. So I could go buy it on Google if I want to. That's how those things work. One does not work without the other. You cannot just give in-text references and you cannot just put a bibliography page. Neither one of them is going to net you a good grade. You need to use them both in conjunction. The other thing I do want to point out is that the title, name, header, citations, bibliography page, they don't count towards your word total. So if you're finished and you have all that information in there and you come in dead on the word total, you have not hit the word minimum for this assignment. So that's just something to think about as you're working through it. Now, I do want to talk about structuring the paper. And this is where I'm going to point out how you use that contextual information. To put it simply, historians, for the most part, except for some really creative ones who wrote cool books, but the rest of us are pretty boring, we structure everything the same way. We have 3 parts to everything we write. And it doesn't matter whether it's a 3-page book review, a 30-page article, or a 300-page book. We structure it the same way. We do it in introduction, body, and conclusion. Those 3 basic concepts. So in your introduction, you need to do 2 things. 2 key things here. You need to, 1, state your thesis. Now your thesis, you're not reinventing the wheel. I've already pretty much told you what to do for this paper. Your thesis should say something to the effect of, anti-slavery advocates tend to use capitalism and democracy as their argument, as their analytical concepts, and pro-slavery advocates use these concepts. Or you could say your thesis could be as simple as pro-slavery advocates and anti-slavery advocates use the same sorts of analytical concepts to make their arguments or to justify their points. And so really your thesis needs to be formed off of what you've read. I can't tell you what your thesis is. That depends on what you gleaned from reading these primary source documents. So that's one thing your introduction has to do. You have to tell the reader what you're going to do in the rest of the paper. And then the other part, in any good history paper, you need to provide context. You can't just go, you can't say my thesis is that that anti-slavery and pro-slavery advocates use the same sorts of analytical concepts. In the first document, here's what so-and-so says. There's no setup there. What is the broader context into which this argument is taking shape? And this is why you need to use the textbook. You have to read the chapter on slavery and sectionalism to understand why any of these people ever sat down and wrote the documents you're going to be analyzing in the first place. You need to explain why they're writing this. You need to tell your reader what's going on in the 1850s that's making people sit down and put pen to paper to argue why there should or shouldn't be slavery in the first place. And so that's what your introduction, the first paragraph or maybe first two paragraphs of your paper should be doing, depending on the length of your paragraphs. So that's how you write your introduction, and you need citations. If you're pulling information from the textbook, you need citations. And I don't want this to be broad. Your context is not broad. It's not just some big thing that you don't need to think about that you throw out at the beginning of the paper. What this is you need to be talking about key events that made Americans argue over this institution. You need to talk about westward expansion. You need to talk about the Mexican-American War. You need to talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You need to talk about the expansion into California, the Compromise of 1850. These are all things that are forcing Americans to start reanalyzing their relationship to slavery as a legal institution. And so that's why they're writing these documents, and that's the information that needs to appear in your introduction. Now, the body of your paper is what we say you're making subpoints there. But they're all talking back to what you said in your thesis. If your thesis was pro-slavery advocates use democracy and capitalism, and anti-slavery advocates use democracy and mobility, then your body paragraphs need to be showing me the evidence of that. Where are your anti-slavery advocates using mobility? Show it to me on paper. I want to see the evidence. And that's what you're doing with your body paragraphs. With each document, with the 4 documents that you pull out, you need to be telling me, first and foremost, what is the main point of that author? What are they arguing? Tell me what the entirety of the document says. You can't just go take one line out and then analyze the line in a vacuum. You need to read the entire document and then tell me the overall gist of what that document says. And then you can go into their subpoints and say, here, he uses mobility. And here, this guy writes about mobility. And here, he's using democracy. And that's how you break down these documents and analyze them in your body paragraphs. Then finally, your conclusion is the simplest part. This is where you restate your thesis, and then you briefly review how your evidence reinforces your thesis, how your evidence has proved your point. And then you close out the paper by examining the broader impact of the events that we're talking about. In slavery, let me just tell you, you're not reinventing the wheel here. I'm not looking for people to go in and write a dissertation on this. The end result of this is the Civil War. It's the country fracturing in two and going to war with itself. So that is how you would want to structure this paper. I'm not saying you have to do it that way, but all of those elements, regardless of how you choose to put them in order, need to show up in your paper or you will lose points. That's what I'm looking for. So in the document that I posted up on Blackboard, the supplemental instructions, I show you examples of in-text references, how they're used. I show them in use. I even wrote a little paragraph there that shows you how you use these things. And this is ultimately going to be the same model that you follow. So just make sure you take a look over that. I don't want to get anybody coming back after the assignment's turned in and said, well, I didn't know how to cite any of this stuff. It's all listed. Every source that we give you on Blackboard, the citation's listed there. We show you how to use it in in-text references and in the bibliography page. I even wrote a little paragraph here and showed you need a in-text citation after each statement that requires citation. And so it's not just, I'm going to write 3 paragraphs and then I all got it from the same place, so here's 1 citation. It doesn't work like that. Citations take time. This is legwork. And so it's not something that you can just go, I'll just throw them in afterwards and pretend they cover what I said. They need to be linked to the specific statements that you're making in your paper. So coming down, we're now on to the third part. I've talked about what the paper is about. I've talked about structuring it. Now these helpful tips and the common pitfalls that I see. Now, the first one is that there is no such thing as over-citation. I have never once in my life gone, ooh, you've got too many citations in your paper, I'm taking points off for that. So if you ever are in doubt, if you're ever thinking to yourself, do I need a citation here? The answer is yes. Put a citation in. If you even think you need it, put one in. Because you'll never get penalized for having too many citations. If you plagiarize and there isn't a citation where you need one, you're going to get an automatic 0. And so it's always better to err on the side of caution. Make sure you're doing that. Secondly, do not plagiarize. Any evidence of plagiarism will result in an automatic 0. No questions asked, no ifs, ands, or buts. It's not a conversation that I'm going to have with you. I'm going to tell you I found it. I'm going to show you where I found it. And when I see that this evidence of plagiarism, it's a big 0 on the paper. And if it's extremely grievous, I will actually take that up with the dean of students and have that entered into your academic record. I take plagiarism incredibly seriously. I get offended when people steal from other people and then give it to me as if it's their own work. So, plagiarism can be tricky. I fully admit this. You don't have to intend to plagiarize. You don't have to mean to plagiarize. But you can still do it and get the 0. And so what I want to point out here is that every statement that you pull from a source requires a citation. It is not just quotations. It's not just the direct quotes that you pull out of the document. It is every single statement that you pull from my lectures, every single statement that you pull from the textbook, every single statement that you pull from the primary source documents needs a citation. And this is really, really critical. I don't want to see a long series of quotes. You should have, at most, 2, maybe 3 sentences worth of quotes in a 2.5 or 3-page paper. That is the truth. I have routinely found that students incorrectly use quotes to the point that they don't even really write a paper. A common problem that I see every semester is people structuring their paper like this. I write the first sentence, I go, slavery was a big problem in America, which is a stupid statement to make. It says nothing to your reader of any value. But they start off with a big generalized blanket statement, and then they have 4 lines worth of a quote, and then they go, so as you can see, this is what the author thought. So what I'm going to do, if you turn in a paper that looks like that to me, is I'm going to go in and delete every quote you have in the paper, and then I'm going to grade what's left. And so if your paper is nothing but a big series of quotes, you're going to end up with a bunch of disjointed sentences where you did no analysis, none of the work that I've asked you to do, and you're going to end up with a really poor grade. So I want to be very, very clear about this. As a general rule, I don't want to see any quotes. Most of you should be able to write this paper without pulling out a single quote. The only time you ever use quotes in formal writing is when another author said something so beautifully eloquent and succinctly and perfectly that you couldn't say it any better in fewer words. And so you put their quote in instead. And so that's not going to be a big, long paragraph. That's not going to be 8 lines worth of material. That's going to be probably 1 sentence, if you're lucky. And so as a general rule, don't use quotes. It's really not worth it. You need to learn how to properly paraphrase. That's one of the goals that we lay out as a learning objective in the history department for our students. If you have any questions about how to do this, you can always come to me, or you can go to the Reading and Writing Center. They have a very good instruction on how you paraphrase properly. And then also the UHD library has resources. And they also have resources to explain what plagiarism is, how it works, and when you're running afoul of academic honesty policies. So the other thing that I tend to see is generalized blanket statements with little to no meaning. And look, I'm a realist. I understand why this happens. You guys don't do this because you think you're writing a magnum opus. Students do this because they're looking to fill space. But I know you're looking to fill space, and that's exactly what I'm going to view it as. It's not a worthwhile sentence. You're just trying to meet a word minimum. There's plenty here to write about. We're asking a lot of you in these papers in terms of analysis. You're not going to be short of material to meet the word minimum. But I see statements like, the Industrial Revolution was a period of history. No kidding. Every period was a period of history. Anything that came in the past was. That's a stupid statement. It doesn't need to be made. You might often hear people say, there's no such thing as a dumb statement or a dumb question. Well, there is. In formal writing, if you're going to take time to put something like that to paper, it's not worth your time and it's not worth your reader's time. America had a bad slavery problem. Is there such a thing as a good slavery problem? Is there a good problem at all? And so, no, this is, again, a pointless statement. It's just somebody trying to talk about value judgments from a modern period, and it's not doing you any good. I've actually seen sentences that read like, African Americans were people of African descent living in America. No kidding. You have to assume that your reader is at least at a level where they understand that. And so you don't need to put statements like that in your paper. When I see those, I was an undergraduate, graduate at 1.2. That is, I understand you're trying to fill space, but it's not going to bump your grade up. We're going to see right through that for what it is. So you need citations. I just want to really drive this one home. You need citations for any evidence pulled from a source. I often see students thinking that it's only quotations that need a citation. That is not true. Anytime you take anything from a source, you need a citation. So an example I usually give of this is if you were to say millions of people were moved across the Atlantic in the Atlantic slave trade. That's common knowledge. No, you don't need a citation for that. When you say 12 to 13 million people were moved across the Atlantic in the Atlantic slave trade, you need a citation because that number is the end result of years and years and years of people working hard to come up at that number. They put their lives and their livelihood on the line to do research and come out with those numbers. You didn't come up with it. You didn't know it. You pulled it from a textbook that's built on their work. Give the textbook credit. Give my lectures credit. Give the people who have done the research credit. Now, of those two things, one's going to get you a good grade and the other one is not. If you're going to say millions of people were moved across the Atlantic in the Atlantic slave trade, you're not going to be the guy who gets the A or the person who gets the A. If you say 12 to 13 million, that's the level of specificity we look for in a university level paper. So that's really what you're shooting for there. For that 12 to 13 million, you want that level of specificity. You want to talk about the events, give their dates, give the locations, give them some real grounding, some real detail. You definitely want to avoid repetition. I see undergraduates routinely will say the same thing over and over again, just slightly differently. Africa, the Atlantic slave trade was badly impacted Africa. Africa was devastated. It took a horrible toll on Africa. Africa had a hard time recovering from the Atlantic. You said the same thing 5 sentences in a row. You don't need to, it's not worth saying again. If you have something that's worth saying, say it once, you put a period at the end and you move on. So some other little key tips of advice, certainly not as important as the other ones that I've been pointing out, is you want to keep it simple. Don't try to use words that you don't really understand. I commonly see where students will try to use a big word that sounds really, really nice, but they don't use it the right way. But don't keep it super, don't go too simple. This is a formal academic paper. If you're using conjunctions, abbreviations with the exception of useful acronyms, any kind of text talk, informal language, slang, inappropriate language, you are going to be penalized for that. This is a formal paper. It needs to be written in that manner. You want to avoid absolutes. The example I give here is everyone in the world likes chocolate better than strawberry. That is an unprovable thing. If one person out of the billions of people on this planet say, nah, I like strawberry better, even just to be a pain in my butt, then my point just completely unravels. Good writers don't use absolutes in the field of history. Scholars in social sciences and humanity, we deal in gray areas. We deal in areas of nuance. What we look for is to reflect on the nuance and bring multiple perspectives into our writing. So the same thing goes for value judgments. It really gets me when people use, we've given you the analytical concepts to use in this paper. Democracy, difference, mobility, and capitalism. Those are your analytical concepts. Good and bad don't count as analytical concepts. But too often I see people, this guy was bad because he used the N-word in his paper or in his document, so he must be a racist, so he's bad. That is the lowest level of intellectual engagement that you could give to the document. Basically what you're saying is you found one word that's offensive in modern times, so you're not going to read the rest of the document, and you're not going to pay attention to what the person says. And so I've seen that happen again and again, where people see offensive language to us in 2020, and they just throw out the rest of the document and call the guy a racist for the rest of the paragraph. I'm not asking you to judge the person who wrote the document. I'm asking you to analyze how they justified their point. Just because you don't like what they said doesn't mean that you can ignore the rest of their point. You need to understand their overall argument to write about it in this paper. So that's just something that I really, it's one of my pet peeves, because I think that students do it a lot and it becomes a very ahistorical paper. I get a paper that talks about, this is how we feel about slavery in the modern time. We're not in the modern. This is a history class. That's not what I'm asking you to write about. Let sociology, let's philosophy, let psychology deal with modern times. Let anthropology deal with modern times. That's not our field. History deals with the past. You need to analyze the past from its own contemporary context. So, proofread. I cannot emphasize this enough. When you turn in a paper that is riddled with just poorly written sentences, lacking grammatical structure, lacking any kind of proper punctuation or syntax, when you don't go through and proofread your paper, basically what you say is, here, I turned it in, I don't care what happens after that. And that's going to show up in your grade. You are going to suffer. So your essay should respond to the assignment prompt. Don't go off course here. We've given you everything you need. I've given you the analytical concepts. I've told you how to come up with a thesis. I've given you the documents you need to analyze. We've given you the contextual information for free in our textbook. You have everything you need right here. And so don't go rogue. Don't go off and copy half a Wikipedia page and then just put it in your own words and try to do what it is that you think is right. I'm telling you what needs to be done. I'm grading it by those standards. And so you want to follow those standards. So suss out the main point of the documents, please. This is really, really important, because I think more so than any other mistake I see, this is the one I get the most. And this is, undergraduates tend to do this. They would go and they read one sentence from a 3-page document. And then they spend the rest of the time in their papers talking about that one sentence. And rarely is that one sentence as important as the author of these papers tends to think it is. They miss the overall point of the document. You are not going to be able to read 2 to 3 sentences. These are short documents already. You have to read it in its entirety and then arrive at your conclusion of what the main point is. If you're analyzing sentences or passages from the documents, you're going to get a really poor grade, because you're not getting the big picture and you're not going to be able to draw out the most important parts of their arguments. So don't use people's first names. It's not Abraham. His name is Abraham Lincoln. You don't know him. He's not your close personal friend. You're not a contemporary. You call him Lincoln. You don't call him Abraham. So people get that wrong all the time. But then again, even this late in the semester, I still get people turning in papers to Mr. Davis, which is not my name. So pay attention to that kind of stuff, because again, all you're really saying when you turn in papers that look like this is, I don't care what grade I got. And you're going to get a grade that reflects that accordingly. So identify the speaker for every quotation. Although I've already been through it, please don't use a lot of quotation. You're going to get a really poor grade. I can't be any more clear about that. Of all the things that really rub me the wrong way, I've already read these documents. I've been doing this for 5 years almost. This will be my 5th year now. So I've done this 8 times over the semester since I've been at UHD. I've read these documents. I know what they say. I don't want to read them again in your paper. I want to read what you have to say. I want to read how you analyze the position of these authors. Finally, there's one thing here that historians don't address this enough, and it's something that I come across a lot being a historian of Africa, and also, with my specialization in North America coming in African American history. So, you are going to encounter offensive language. Someone's going to drop an N-bomb in here somewhere. And so it's going to be rife in those documents that you're reading through, the pro-slavery documents. They do. This contains offensive language. This is racist, offensive people by our modern standards writing their position and their sort of take on the situation as it comes to slavery. You're going to be encountering these things. Do not repeat offensive language in your writing. If it is in a quote, and again, I really got to just say it again, don't use a lot of quotes. I don't want to see a bunch of quotes. Paraphrase. If it's in a quote, then yes, you use the offensive language that they use. However, I've seen students that they read the first document and somebody refers to African Americans by the N-word. Then they continue for the rest of their paper, and they don't mean to be racist or offensive. What they're trying to do is be historically accurate to the terminology. But you don't need to do that. You're not writing in 1850. You're a modern person. You don't use that word in your own writing. So do not replicate it. Don't use it 40 or 50 times throughout the paper because one of the sources used it. That doesn't make it more historically accurate. It just makes it really, really offensive. Let the authors in 1850s, that was their language. It was their time period. That was accepted use. That was a publishable word that everybody used. Nobody got offended by it. And so today, it's not the same. And so you don't use that. We don't publish that word anymore. Historians don't use it. Nobody uses it. It only comes up when you're reading old documents. And if you need to pull a quote out of it, then it's okay to use that word in your paper. But when you are writing, do not use that word. It just makes you look bigoted and offensive and racist. So don't do that. So I went way over my time, pretty much double. I knew that was going to happen, but I tried. I really did. Make sure you read through this supplemental instruction document, and then make sure you're reading the assignment prompt carefully and following all of the sort of aspects of this assignment. You cannot do this in one night. This is not a crunch time assignment. You're not going to be able to get it done start at the morning that it's due and turn it in by 11:59 on the dot. You are going to run into problems. So make sure you're giving this ample thought, ample time, getting your citations right, getting your document analysis right, getting your context right. It's all really important. And if you have any questions or concerns, I'm always available to you. Please make sure you reach out beforehand. Don't come to me afterwards and say, I don't know why I didn't do well. It doesn't do you any good then. So that's it for this week's little lecture video. That's where I'm going to wrap it up. So take care of yourselves and feel free to drop me a line if you got any questions.